From the media, the public, the politicians, the question is the same. With all the government support during the pandemic, where is all that money coming from and how long is it going to take to pay back? Well, we'll remind ourselves today about modern monetary theory and the principle that money doesn't have to be paid back. But when so much new money has been created, isn't there a danger that there is an imbalance? And is that part of the reason we are seeing inflation starting to get out of control? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, there's the eternal question whenever the government has to step in with a lot of assistance, like, for example, when there's a pandemic on, for example, the question is often asked, where's all the money coming from? Well, you'll know if you're a regular listener to this podcast that money is fundamentally created in two ways. So we won't dwell on this too long today because we've discussed it so many times. But just a quick précis, Steve, step in if I get this wrong, but I think I've got it right. First of all, it comes from commercial bank loans. They put money into your account that didn't exist before you asked for that loan. And they just need to make sure that they've got enough reserves to cover any of those interbank settlements that happen as you spend that money with companies or people who use another bank. So that's number one. Then there's government spending. They spend money. They issue bonds, which are bought first off by commercial banks. They switch cash reserves for those bonds. So the government has the cash, which it can then spend. So that's new money as well. So, Steve, I guess during the pandemic, we've probably seen quite a bit of both of those, which is why we're seeing the money supply increase so much. And it's skyrocketed over the last year and a half.
Yeah, and I mean, in the case of both of them with reserves, banks used to have 30 days to do that settlement, by the way, so banks could actually run their reserves down, not have sufficient reserves, in fact, have negative reserves, and then over a given 1 month to get them back to the stage where they were positive. And normally they'd borrow those reserves from another bank because if you have an interbank transfer, then the reserves go from the lending bank to the bank where the borrower puts their money. Of course, that was back before computers. It took 30 days back then. Now, of course, with computers, it takes 45 days. So they have even longer to get their books settled. And in the case of government bonds, I mean, I know some monetary reformers make a song and dance about the government needing, according to legislation, to sell bonds ahead of actual spending. But the amount of excess reserves that have been created by the government over time mean that given bonds being sold, sort of monthly auctions are quite common. That sort of frequency is quite common. There's enough existing reserves to enable the first tranche to be easily covered, and then with later tranches, the deficit itself creates both the reserves that are used to buy the bonds and the money in people's accounts. So there's no effective constraint coming from reserves on lending of either banks or money creation by the government.
Right. But in normal times, the Bank of England says most of the money in the economy is created by banks when they provide loans. So that must be more of the money supply than coming from overspending governments.
Absolutely.
But if that's the case, I mean, that money does have to be paid back eventually. Of course, when it gets paid back, the loan gets paid back, there'll be someone else taking out another loan. But the fact that the money supply keeps on increasing must mean, unless banks are offering ever greater loans, the supply won't expand. And we need the supply to expand because if we've got inflation, which obviously is, a part and parcel of the survival of the monetary system, if we want the money to supply to expand, we need banks to give more and more loans for that expansion to happen.
Yeah,
that's a problem.
The system,
isn't it?
In monetary terms, the system won't expand unless banks lend more than they get back in repayments, or unless governments run a deficit. And this is, I've actually just refereed a very good paper actually, where the statistician was taking a look at where does the demand come from, how to model the demand. It's actually a mathematician looking at how to model demand in the economy, and said a lot of non-mainstream models have this idea of autonomous spending. And when I looked at his classifications of autonomous spending, it was all things financed either by credit or by governments running a deficit. And when you think about it, it then says to actually get a measurable increase in the GDP of an economy measured in dollars per year, The fundamental way that is done is increasing the number of dollars. And the way that numbers of dollars are increased by banks lending more than they get back in repayments, or by government spending more than they get back in taxation.
But I mean, that means if it's people getting loans, then it's debt, isn't it? It's people running up debt, and debt is really just bringing spending forward. I get a loan, I spend it, then I spend years cutting back on my spending as I try and pay back that loan. But so ultimately, how much I spend is determined how much money I earn, of course. So I can't spend more than I earn, but I can bring a bit forward by getting a loan. So there's that's a limit, then, isn't it, on how much obviously is lent out in the end?
But what you see is people spend predominantly based on the amount of money they've got.
Yeah.
And if you have an increase in the money and an increase in debt, that's sustainable so long as the turnover of money enables you to make enough of a gain from your economic activity to finance the interest costs on the borrowing. And that, the fundamental story is both credit and net government deficits are sources of additions to aggregate demand. And
the multiplier would mean that, you'd hope that extra money, therefore, would, create the multiplier effect. People would turn it over faster because you'd be putting it to productive use. But that's not really happening, is it? I mean, the more we're seeing the money supply expand, the more we're seeing this debt being issued, whether it's to individuals or to the government. We seem to be seeing the velocity of money slowing down.
Well, this is largely because of, first of all, the increasing level of debt itself reduces the income of the poor. This is something that comes out of my complex systems modelling of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. And that shows that there's a direct relationship, an increase in the level of debt and a fall in the share going to workers. And there's a complicated dynamic behind it, but it is quite easy to understand what actually is going on there. But what that means is, even though the additional money borrowed into the economy in the models that I build and to some extent in the real world enables a high level of turnover of the economy itself, it ends up pushing the wealth towards the bankers away from the workers. And the bankers, by definition, are much wealthier than the workers and therefore spend more slowly. So you also get a double whammy that the velocity of circulation falls. And that is...
And let's be honest. I mean, if a bank is giving a loan to somebody and it's somebody who's on struggle street on a minimum wage, they're probably not going to give it to them. If somebody else comes along and says, hey, I need this money to buy a house, there's an asset that you can attach the loan to, or I'm going to use it to buy shares. I mean, obviously, in both those cases, non-productive uses of money, but the money is being created. We're seeing the money supply expand.
Yeah, and that's the danger that we've got. So that's over and above the sort of generic tendency I was talking about earlier. But that means we have a tendency for the level of debt to rise, and that increasing level of debt to be associated with a fall in the rate of circulation of money. So that you end up getting caught in a double whammy. You end up with a huge amount of debt, and then people who borrow themselves individually decide to spend more slowly because that's the way they try to accumulate some of that additional money in their own accounts so that they can pay their level of debt down. And you get this just slows the whole economy down. And that's what we've been seeing, really. You look at the empirical data, this has been happening since the 1960s. There's been, even though the rate of turnover of money itself increased up to the peak of the inflation rate in the prelude to the Volcker recession in the early 1980s. Even though that velocity rose across that period of time, the rate of economic growth was slowing right from 1960 forward. So the combination of the two, when you get into a lower inflation environment, which is where we found ourselves until just recently, is just a plunge in how fast money turns over. And that ends up with you being in a stagnant economy.
So to what extent do central banks look at this? Because they obviously think...
Pardon me? What?
Well, I mean, supposedly they should be. I think it's their job, isn't it? But they think
I can talk out of school these days. Guy Debelle, who was deputy director of the Reserve Bank of Australia.
RBA.
In a conversation with me, the conference in Adelaide about 12 or 13 years ago, said to me, and I quote, "I don't know why you worry about the debt to GDP ratio because you're comparing a stock to a float."
Right, which we've talked about before, in a recent podcast,
So That shows a complete lack of awareness of the very issues we're talking about here.
And if you want to increase your awareness and understand the role that bonds play and central governments and issuing them and central banks buying them up and then putting them back onto the open market, what impact does all that have on the money supply? We'll explore all of that in the full version of this podcast. To listen to that, you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen. Or go to debunkingeconomics.com and subscribe to the podcast there. Back again. I know it's Christmas, but we are back again next week with another one. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening.